Thank you for the prayers, Theo, and for the beautiful singing this morning, guys. Good morning, everyone. I have to say it's been a nice morning of feeling very warm in many ways, at least the internal type of warmth. Having spent so many years of my life, I guess, with people here who I'd consider family, it's always a pleasure to visit and really appreciate the chance to share a little thought this morning. I hope that it'll have a right dose of encouragement and also challenge for everyone. And maybe if there are people here who have recently restarted an interest or ignited an interest in learning a bit more about God, or maybe if you're a bit more along the skeptical line of things, I just want to especially say that you're extra welcome today. Every single one of us here is learning, so you're in the right place. I hope that today's little thought will be something that is a blessing the way that it's challenged me. And if there are people who want to have a little bit more of a chat about it at the end of the sort of service this morning, I'm definitely happy to have some conversations and bounce around some ideas. I love that side of things as well. But I guess, guys, before I maybe start getting into a little story, I might just mention that one of the stories from today probably only makes sense if I mention that I've gone through medical school, because it's one of the experiences that I had during that process. And I remember thinking back to a time relatively early on in my training where I was a student in a hospital. And part of our job at the time was we would join doctors in their hospital duties. We would visit patients with them. We would help write their notes. There would be lots of jobs, often some of the menial tasks that we would take care of. But constantly throughout the process, we were learning and learning. And as someone who probably would describe myself as a pretty hard-working and conscientious student, I remember really clearly at the time I was learning so much every day. But one of the things that very quickly became apparent is that no matter how much I was learning, there always seemed to be so much more to learn. It was just impossible to feel like I'd finally grasped it. There was one particular elderly woman who had a problem with a nasty cough. It was a pretty severe lung problem she'd had for many years. And after one of our morning ward rounds, we'd finished the day's jobs. One of the senior doctors asked me, "Sam, do you mind having a bit of a chat to this woman? Go see her, spend a bit of time asking her some medical questions and learn a bit more about her condition." And this is something that we would use regularly as a tool. And if you haven't ever sort of had that approach to learning, it's probably one of the best I can think of, to get all the book knowledge and the details and put it next to a story and remember it through that sort of a way. And so I took a clipboard and a pen in my hands, knocked on her door and asked if I could come in. I saw this woman and she was incredibly short of breath. She didn't look comfortable at all, just constantly coughing. After inviting me to have a seat, I sat down and noticed that she was incredibly frail, so thin and worn of years and years of using so much energy just to keep breathing. She had oxygen being delivered through her nostrils, and there was a cup of mucus sitting next to her bedside, half full of thick green phlegm that she'd been coughing up just from the last couple of hours. I knew a little bit of her condition from some of that morning's ward round. I knew that there wasn't really much left the doctors could do for her. There wasn't a cure. And there, a junior medical student, I felt like the only thing that I could do was to learn. There was nothing I could offer this woman, barely even a glimpse of hope, in all honesty. I was just there to receive with not much to give at all. And so that very well-known feeling of there's not much I can do here came to mind. So I started with the things that I had come to do. Asked a bit about her. What's your name? How old are you? How long have you been in hospital? What's brought you to hospital? I see you've got quite a bit of a cough at the moment. How long have you had that for? It seems to me to be a bit of difficulty breathing. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And the questions went on and on. I'm going to come back to this story very shortly because before continuing, I want to spend a bit of time on a related story from the Bible. It's a story that has a few similarities because firstly, there was nothing more that anyone could do. And I guess you could kind of say that there was a breathing problem because it's the story of Lazarus. And in this particular story, he'd actually stopped breathing. For those who maybe aren't as familiar with this story of Lazarus, I'm just going to try and give a real quick summary before we look at a couple of parts in a bit more detail. You see, Lazarus lived in a town called Bethany, and he had two very close sisters, Mary and Martha. And at some point in his life, he became quite unwell. And at the time, Jesus, one of his close friends, was quite a while away. Jesus got news of Lazarus' illness, but interestingly, he actually delayed his return to the town of Bethany. He delayed it so much that a few days later, Jesus found out that Lazarus had actually passed away. And not just a couple of days, it was actually 4 days from the time that Lazarus had passed to when Jesus found out. By this point in time, everyone had a very clear picture that there was nothing more anyone could do. And Jesus returned to the town of Bethany and was greeted by quite a sight. He saw the hurt of Mary and Martha, and more than that, there was an entire community that had gathered to mourn the passing of someone who was well loved. Now, I'm going to admit, I'm going to give the spoiler alerts now and jump straight to an important detail of how this story ends. Jesus knew something coming into this town that no one else did. He knew that he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead. But there's something really, really interesting in this story, and I'm going to read a passage from John chapter 11 that adds something that I find quite odd. It's from John chapter 11, verses 33 to 35. John chapter 11, verses 33 to 35. In this section, and this is as Jesus is entering into Bethany, we read that when Jesus saw her weeping, and this is speaking of Mary, Lazarus' sister, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And then we read the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Does anyone see the irony of this scenario here? Jesus knows that in just a few minutes he's going to perform, probably bar his resurrection, one of the most spectacular miracles of his time here on earth. Just give it 10 minutes and all the tissues will be gone, and there's going to be probably one of the biggest parties the town has ever seen. He knows that this is about to be such a big celebration, yet despite that, he weeps. Now, there are probably a few reasons why this might have been the case. But I just want to spend a bit of time with you today reflecting on one. And it's a reason that I think has the potential to change so much of our own lives, especially our relationship to others. And it's something that can be summarized in, I think, one word, the word of sympathy. Sympathy. Sympathy is, and without going into differences between sympathy or empathy, I'm not much of an English grammar sort of expert in these areas, but the general idea is that it's a feeling or expression of sincere concern for someone who's experiencing something difficult or painful. I guess it's often used interchangeably with compassion. Sympathy is understanding another person's grief. And I think sympathy is often what love looks like during times of pain. And here Jesus embraces compassion even though he knows things are about to end very, very happily. He goes through the journey and the experience that Mary and Martha and so many others are going through, even though he knows that their tears will turn into laughter within a matter of minutes. And I think reflecting on this story, there are 3 points where I felt especially challenged reflecting on this. And the first one, potentially the most important of them all, is the realization that God has sympathy for us. I think that's one of the most incredible ideas that we read in the Bible, that God and Jesus have sympathy for us. Even though we have all these promises in the Bible that things will work out in the end, that all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose, as we read in Romans 8. He still shares the parts of life that hurt. Even though God has all the answers, he still has compassion when we don't know what to do. There's a verse that captures that picture so beautifully in 2 Corinthians, verses 1 to 3, chapter 1, verses 3 to 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 3 to 4, which I'll read for you. It says there, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God." God is our comforter. He shows us sympathy. He sheds tears for us. His stomach twists into knots when he sees injustice happening in our lives, and he cares so deeply about our own anxieties. He shows love in the face of suffering. And I think that's such an important idea, because there are people who have been shown a picture of God that maybe fits more of a picture that he expects you to push through the sufferings and then everything's going to be okay one day. That if you just go through the really hard time, everything will be fine later down the track. And while that is so true, I think it loses sight of the fact that he cares about what you're going through now, that he wants to be part of the journey, that all his promises aren't for a better time, but he wants to be involved in the here and now. And so I want to give you the reminder that God cares, that he knows the pain during the tough times, and that he wants to walk with you through those times as well. That verse we just read from 2 Corinthians is one that I find especially relevant because of also the way it ends, which brings me to the second point, that God firstly has sympathy for us, but that God hopes that as he shows that love and fills our lives full of it, that it's something we can extend to others as well. And so I think the second point I want to leave with you today is that God has a calling for us to show sympathy to others. There are so many verses we can read in the Bible describing this, and I've got 3 really short ones I want to share with you as well today. The first is from Galatians chapter 6, verse 2, where we read, "Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." Another one from Romans 12:15, "Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep." And then lastly from 1 Peter 3 verse 8, Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. We see a really direct challenge from the Bible to not contain God's love only for ourselves, but to show it in the pain and suffering of others as well. And I want to make it clear, especially with some of the people who I see day to day, I'm not necessarily saying this that every person at every stage in life is in a position where they should or can carry lots of other people's burdens. Maybe even one is overwhelming for them. But I think so many of us are in positions where if we have eyes for opportunities to encourage and uplift those, even if it's one person, it's not hard often to find opportunities to do that. Most of us are in a position where we have the privilege of being the support and the sympathetic ear to help carry another person's burden. Look for those opportunities. Don't forget the calling that we have from the Bible as well. Now, the third point is a bit of an interesting one that reflecting on this story has been a special challenge to me, and I think it's some of the natural interaction that tends to happen between sympathy and growth in knowledge, and especially in confidence. You see, I think there's a lot of times where those two can go in often opposite directions, not out of necessity, but maybe as a natural human tendency. And I guess there are a couple of scenarios that I just want to throw out to you to maybe see whether they resonate at all, maybe the way they have with me so often, in terms of how hard it can be to show sympathy in certain situations. Have you ever sort of had the idea go through your mind that if that person just stopped that one unhealthy habit, their health would be so much better? Or if only they used their money on this and stopped wasting it on that thing, their life would be in so much more of a wholesome and better place. Or if that person didn't do X, Y, Z, their home would be all the better for it, and the relationships in their home. Now, what I'm not saying in this is that those ideas are necessarily wrong, because so often those observations are full of truth, but there's a mindset in it that can be very different from the one that God portrays in the Bible. To try and make that a little bit more concrete for you, I want to pick an example that I see a bit in my work and maybe helps illustrate the point. And I want to compare two individuals. One who's let's go a 60-year-old gentleman who's been smoking 20 cigarettes a day for the last 40 years. And I'm not having a go at the cigarette side of things. It's just a scenario that's very, very familiar to me. And they rock up to the doctors one day and they're found to have lung cancer. And the next day you have a 60-year-old man who's never smoked a cigarette in their life, who's always stayed fit and healthy, who's taken reasonable, healthy dietary measures, and is also found to have lung cancer. Do you find that your sympathy tends to gravitate towards one? I know for me it definitely does. But I want to throw into that scenario the question of how do you think God feels towards these two men? Do you think his sympathy is favoring of one over the other? I guess that's probably getting into a long conversation on its own about maybe how God would approach it and why we often feel the way we do, and a conversation maybe we can chat about afterwards. But I think the take-home point for me is that so often as humans, our natural tendency is to carry oversimplified answers to complex problems, and we have a tendency to lose sympathy. Yet Jesus has all the answers to every single problem and never loses the slightest bit of sympathy. I'm just going to repeat that again. So often we carry oversimplified answers to complicated problems and we tend to lose sympathy. Yet Jesus has all the answers to every problem and still carries sympathy for all. And I guess for me, there's a challenge in that, maybe a bit of a danger I'm aware of in myself, that the more we learn and often the more we grow in confidence, it's easy to lose sight of God's sympathy for others. And that's so relevant because we have an entire book of truths and blessings that we're asked to share with the world around us. Things that our world would be so much better off if they had the chance to hear and see put in action around them. Yet even despite how true all of these things are, if it's shared from a place or a heart which doesn't have love for these people and doesn't approach their pain and suffering from a heart of sympathy, we may not even be the safest people to share these truths with them. And so I want to leave that little challenge and idea that in those times we feel we have all the answers or things look so black and white, just remember to carry a heart of sympathy first. Be the person who shows love in the face of suffering. I continue to ask further questions of this elderly woman in hospital. How much phlegm do you cough up each day? Do you have any heart problems? Have you ever smoked? And they went on. And after a while, I don't quite know how it happened, we started to talk about her family. We started to talk about her late husband and their many years of marriage together. And at this point, I stopped taking notes. Our conversation continued as she shared about her children, the grandchildren she had, the similarities that she saw in herself with her own children. She began to share a bit about where she lived, the sort of roles she had with work, and some of her most special memories in life as well. By this point, there weren't any more medical questions. We weren't talking about her disease anymore. We were talking about a life full of rich experiences and stories. Thinking of those sorts of things that brought value to her life and the blessings that she reflected on. I only gave very small prompts, encouraging her to keep sharing, showing that I had a genuine interest. And as she continued to share, some of the fears came up. Uncertainty of how this hospital stay would end, what the next days would hold. And that from there progressed to sharing about topics of faith. She shared about the things that gave her hope and encouragement, and an air of peace entered the room. I honestly don't remember how our conversation exactly ended. There have been so many times I've tried to reflect, but the fine details I know have been lost on me over the years. We may have had a prayer together as she welcomed the offer. There might have been an encouraging word. I don't quite remember, but I'm not sure that those details specifically matter. But what I do remember so clearly is that conversation, which lasted an hour, made a difference in that woman's life for that day. I remember seeing a woman who was really distressed and anxious when I came into her room, to one being a bit more peaceful and at rest. I remember a woman who at one point felt very alone and afraid. By the end of the conversation, knowing that she was being cared by for people who felt that she mattered. And it was something that wasn't lost on me how little I'd actually given to this woman. I couldn't offer her anything physical at all. She had the exact same illness, the exact same treatment, the exact same prognosis as just an hour before, but there was a difference that was made simply by the time, the genuine interest, and the sympathy. And as I got home that evening, I reflected on the irony of that conversation, that there was a junior medical student who had nothing to give, so underqualified, very, very lacking in skills, yet in 1 hour, by God's grace, and only God's grace, a dose of sympathy had changed this woman more than any medication, more than any surgery or specialist treatment was able to. And I guess I want to, for me, this is such a strong reminder in those times where I'm sure you have the feeling as well that there's nothing we can give, where we feel we're too old, too young, we don't know enough, we don't have the qualifications, we don't have the energy that maybe we might have or had or may never have. But I want you to know without a doubt that while we carry the character of Christ with us, remember his care for us and his sympathy for others, that we can change or bring about change in people's lives for the better. There will be times where we can bring healing to people that no doctor ever could. It may be that you awaken hope in this person that they couldn't see themselves, that you'll show them love that they may not have seen yet. And so the little thought I want to leave with you today is the challenge to go with God and to do it for the people you get along with, but also to remember it, especially for those who are a bit challenging, who ruffle the feathers, who see the world through a very different set of eyes, to go into conversations and interactions with this people with a heart of sympathy as well. Be the person who shows them love, especially in the times of their pain. That's my little prayer for every one of us.